Dear guests, I would like to express a warm welcome to all of you present in the Sybir Memorial Museum, as well as those who are listening online. Especially welcome our guest professor, David Simon. Welcome to our museum, who is the assistant dean of graduate education, and he also served as a director of the genocide studies program at Yale University. Professor, we are very happy that you are here between us in our museum, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Director, and thank you everybody for being here, both in the room and online. Let me take one moment to call up. There we go. Call up my notes and say just again what a pleasure it is to be here in Białystok, to be part of the extended conference in a way, recognizing the recent well-deserved awards that have been, especially the European award that has been bestowed upon this museum. I had a chance to visit the exhibition this morning, and it's stunning and powerful, both in terms of form and content. So I humbly congratulate you on the award, but more importantly, what the museum represents and its success in presenting its story. The presentation that I'd like to give today is on the question of the question of the role that museums play a part in rebuilding communities. For my own notes, for thinking about this question, thinking about this presentation as I prepared it, I added a three-word question to this title, which is, can museums heal? So memory museums and the challenge of rebuilding communities after atrocities. I think it might be helpful if I provide a little bit of context about myself, because I think that might prepare you for the perspective that I'm going to take here. I'm a political scientist. I'm cursed with finding politics in everything, recognizing that everything is political. When my kids or my friends ask me a question about current affairs or about art or about, I say, well, you have to understand the politics behind it, or we have to see this as something political. And I also study atrocities, genocide in particular, as I'm the director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale. But as I'll mention a little bit more broadly what I mean by atrocities in just a second. And obviously atrocities, genocides, crimes against humanity are political events as well. But so is the historical examination, the reflection upon those atrocities, the efforts to memorialize those atrocities. And so when I say something is political, it's often in common discourse to call something political is to degrade or devalue the efforts that are being undertaken. I don't mean it in that sense. Rather, when I say that memorialization is political, I mean that there's no sort of neutrality, or the idea of neutrality is elusive, that everything is embedded, everything we do in a public space is embedded with a relationship to power, I suppose is the more high-minded way of saying everything is political, and understanding where that power is and how it can be used for, or at least recognized to support the ends that I hope many of us share as being worth supporting. That's where I'm coming from in in making these remarks in the analysis that I'm offering today. So let me then start with a few just sort of a definitional matter. What do I mean by atrocity? Atrocity, there's a working definition of a mass atrocity anyways, which is large-scale and systematic attacks against a civilian population or against civilian populations. And of course, this includes genocide, which has its own UN definition, but is certainly large-scale, is arguably within that UN definition, systematic attack civilian population of a specific identity, racial, ethnic, religious, or national group with the intent to destroy makes it a genocide. But crimes against humanity, there are several, maybe as many as a dozen. There's no actual single definition of crimes against humanity. The closest that we have is their enumeration in the Rome Statute that establishes the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. But it's worth noting, just in the context of being in this museum right now, that forced deportation can be a crime against humanity if it meets certain characteristics. And then certain war crimes are also targeting of civilian populations disproportionately and or without a so-called legitimate military objective makes for an atrocity. And one of the things that I guess brings these crimes, these acts together is that although there's some variation of a legal definition, legal enumeration, even with crimes against humanity, as I mentioned, within the Rome Statute, they're all defined kind of from above. They're defined in terms of what the perpetrator does, as crimes typically are, what the presumed or accused perpetrator is accused of doing. But it's a slightly different matter of what the victims or the target or how it is felt, how it is experienced. And I think one thing about atrocity crimes, what they tend to hold in common is, certainly the injustice of being targeted because, despite being a civilian, not as a combatant, being targeted because of the group to whom one belongs, whether or not there's the necessary genocidal element of intent or not. It is the identity basis, I think, kind of tends to create a certain trauma, knowing that one is targeted for something that one can't avoid. One didn't have a choice but to be a Pole, or to be a Lithuanian, or to be perhaps an American, to be a Catholic, to be Jewish, to be Roma, etc. One doesn't have a choice in these things, and yet one is targeted nonetheless. So these are the distinguishing features, I think, of atrocities themselves. But there's also, because of that, I think, a set of issues related to what happens after atrocities. And as a political scientist, I think I suppose I would describe my interest first and foremost on the question of what happens or what happens after atrocities, or the post-atrocity project or politics, if you will. I liken it sometimes to the idea of when I teach a class, sometimes I say, this is a class about Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, had a great fall. The big question is putting the pieces back together again. And often I will add that the king's horses and the king's men, which is to say the army and the state, we know we're not entirely up to the task. So there's much more to this construction. I have no idea if the nursery rhyme is meant to be an allegory for post-war reconstruction or post-atrocity reconstruction, but it works. What do putting the pieces back together again mean? They mean there's a physical element, certainly. There's a story of, with forced deportation, certainly, but almost all atrocities involve or create some measure of displacement and undoing displacement. Resettling has a physical element, simply answering the question, where do the people go? Where do they go back to? Is there is their space? What do they, if they do go back to their homeland, what structures, what spaces, what infrastructure do they exist with? Or do they stay? Or do they go somewhere else? All of these are possibilities in the wake of atrocity. Stay where they were, go somewhere else. In my tour of the museum this morning, that is certainly one of the outcomes with the deportation of Poles, that some came back, some stayed where they were, some ended up going to a altogether new location. And then, but beyond the physical element, I think, and those physical choices are those choices about the physical questions are very important, but there's also undeniably a social element, a question of how do people relate to one another. And very often, I think one of the key points for me in understanding atrocities is that they are motivated or effectuated by this process of what I call, somewhat awkwardly, I admit, de-belonging, which is to say there's a group that belongs to a civic community, and the project, a unifying project across all atrocities, is to otherize some group, to say to some subset of the broader community, you don't belong. That's de-belonging. And you are either going to be moved someplace else, discriminated against, or even eliminated, even killed. After atrocity, then this question becomes, well, how do you reintegrate? How do you re-belong, to make another even more awkward phrase out of it? One of my favorite authors, when I studied political science, I didn't begin as a scholar of atrocities, actually, of African politics and the question of the new nations of Africa, new in the last now 60, 70 years. The question of how do they successfully forge national identities. And there's a contemporary of mine named Scott Strauss, I think he's the chair of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, who wrote a book about the making nations, but basically nationalism. And his conclusion was, after looking at various factors, were French colonies, former British colonies, was it an economic factor? How is it that some countries hold together with a sense of nationality and other countries seem to be torn apart by subnational, ethnic or tribal, if you will, identities leading to war? And he says he finds that the number one explanatory factor was a conscious effort to make nations. I actually did dissertation research in the country of Zambia, where Kenneth Kaunda, who by many measures was not a very good president. He stayed in power for 27 years. He drove the Zambian economy into the ground. But he had this vision of what he called one nation, one Zambia, and really worked on a country with 72 different tribes, according to official designations, 7 major language groups, not all of which are mutually intelligible, some of which use, I think, at least different symbols. How do you create a nation out of this that holds together? It seems improbable, but he did. Cote d'Ivoire, although Cote d'Ivoire has been war-torn recently, is another example where national focus. Ghana was a national focus. Anyways, that's all about post-colonial construction of a nation, but often you have a similar, in many ways, of course, more difficult challenge in recreating a sense of nation in the wake of atrocities. And I think it involves the civic arrangement. What sort of citizenship do people have? It involves the regularity and types of interactions that different groups will have with one another, and where those interactions happen, especially if they're different religious groups or different, sharing different cultural practices. To what extent are those differences given space to flourish, and to what extent are those differences limited by the need to build nation? And then security guarantees are incredibly important after atrocities. People won't move back. People won't come back if they're not convinced that they will be protected in the future, that what just happened to them won't happen again. And so these are part policy, but it's not just sort of the state policy. It's also social policy. It's about how people choose to relate with to one another. So memory museums or atrocity museums, if you will, play a role in this process. And I think that one of the motivating points in the description of the conference that took place a couple weeks ago was about museums as a space, I think maybe even a safe space for looking at the past. And I think I might quibble a little bit with the use of the word safe there, because, and also agree 100%, I can do both, be on both sides of that. Is that, like, literally museums need to be a safe space. They need to be a place where difficult conversations happen, where difficult ideas, challenging ideas, tragic histories, things that make you sad, mad, upset, alarmed to encounter. They have to happen in a place where there's some safety, and museums provide that. But the safety of those museums is not so much that you don't want people to sort of say, you'll be just as you were before, or after as you were before. Museums should strive to change, and museums shouldn't strive to be so safe that they don't present those difficult ideas. So I think museums play a role in this question obviously play a role in this question of rebuilding after atrocity, rebuilding from a social standpoint in particular. And museums tend to agree. I went through and I found some of the mission statements of for example, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's dedicated to ensuring the permanence of Holocaust memory, understanding, and relevance. Through the power of Holocaust history, the museum challenges leaders and individuals worldwide to think critically about their role in society and to confront anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, prevent genocide, and promote human dignity. Or you could take the Rwandan Genocide Memorial, sometimes known as the Kigali Genocide Memorial. We provide a national and international focal point for remembrance of the genocide against the Tutsi, peace and values education programming for students, educators, and professionals, documentation and preservation of survivor testimony and genocide artifacts, and help for survivors who remain in need of support. Some other museums were harder to find. I'll just add one more, the Srebrenica Memorial, a place of remembrance for the victims of genocide in Srebrenica. The Memorial Center is dedicated to preserving history and combating the forces of ignorance and hatred which make genocide possible. The work of the museum includes research projects, exhibitions, events, and publications intended to increase public awareness of the genocide as well as to commemorate its victims. So you see in these mission statements, it's not just about collecting and displaying artifacts. Obviously, I don't need to convince the people in this room of that observation, and I hope that's not really a radical statement for any audience. But there is really, in each of these cases, in these preeminent memorials, among the preeminent memorials to atrocities in the world, a forward-looking educational project. Educational maybe even, they each mention the word education, but it's education with the design to make the world a better place, improve on the world as it is. And they do this, I think, and what I'd like to do with the rest of this talk is talk about the ways, some of the general ways that museums do this, look at those three museums in particular, again, very, very briefly, without doing justice to the entire projects that those really amazing museums and memorials do, and then to talk about where are some of the maybe contradictions and challenges of being a place of peace, or creating sort of a mindfulness of peace, how that comes into conflict with telling difficult stories, and maybe what some of the fault lines are for addressing these issues, and where choices have to be made. So museums like USHMM, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and KGM, Kigali Genocide Memorial, and Srebrenica Memorial at Podachari, I'll just call it Srebrenica, they have a similar, I think, set of kind of elements to the practice of pursuing those goals. The first is a series of, is a dedication to remembering. So the first involves remember. And what is remembered includes the group itself, the targeted group. These are, again, genocide cases, but it doesn't need to be a genocide. Even here, this museum does a really very strong job of focusing on the pre-atrocity community, the community before the bad things started to happen to them. Looking at who was targeted after that, but what their life was like. After all, specifically with genocide, but I would argue with a broader category of atrocities, one of the goals of the perpetrator is to erase that group. So we have to understand it as a sort of affirmative act of resistance to genocide to represent that group as it was originally. If someone was trying to erase it, the way you counter that is preserve it. Obviously you'd want to preserve all the people, but it's a museum where it's a recognition of something that's happened in the past. So preserving the memory of a people is important in that context. Another way to put it is that it's often stated now that denial of a genocide is the 8th or 7th, 8th, 10th, depending on who you ask, stage of genocide. I don't really believe genocide has stages that are sequential. And Greg Stanton, the person who came up with stages of genocide, I think agrees or says that it's not meant to be a order of in which things happen. But denial happens throughout, and especially after everything else is over, the perpetrators will say, no, that didn't happen. There was never any genocide there. Maybe even there was never any people like that there. We see it all the time. So restoring, respecting, remembering what was before is a way of rejecting denial. And then acknowledging that this group was the group that might have been targeted and damaged in the course of genocide. And it's not just groups, it's individuals. We remember individuals. We see their faces, we read their names, we listen to their testimony in many of these memorial museums. Museums also, it's important that they tell the history, and this is a little separate from remembering who was targeted. In a way, this begins with talking about the perpetrators. What were they trying to do? What were their motivations, their objectives? What was their vision of the world that somehow forced them to otherize, to try to make some group not belong to their political and civic community? What were the motives for doing that? So even if we can recognize the project, a slightly separate conversation is what were the perpetrators, the elites in particular, what were they trying to achieve? National purity or elimination of a threat? These understanding motives is important. And then I think understanding the popular compliance, such as it was, or non-interference by non-elites. That also matters in understanding what happens. But it's a focus on perpetrators almost necessarily in telling the story. And I think that is essential for coming to a recognition about the past. So is understanding the response, what the targeted group did. And that includes sort of examining and understanding the full scope of suffering and victimization of the perpetrator group. And that's a common element in these. It's very difficult to portray, and often, it requires, I think, in the best sense of the word, some cleverness to sort of represent how people suffered in the course of an atrocity. But almost all three of these museums that I've mentioned also gives some focus to the idea of resilience and the ideas of resilience and resistance. How did people preserve their culture despite persecution? How did people preserve physical vitality in situations that were designed to undermine it? How did people fight back? What means of even trying to turn the tables on their perpetrators did they pursue? And then third, besides focusing on how it happened and understanding response, is looking at the external context. What was the rest of the world doing? Who helped and when? Typically, later in the game, there was some help that arrived. Almost always, I would probably argue, and certainly in the case of these three cases, in the Holocaust, Rwanda, and Srebrenica, too late. But there was some form of assistance, and in each case there was negative assistance. Who didn't help? Who from the outside maybe abetted the perpetrators, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes very intentionally, and why? That's all part of the history. Now, the final part, I think, is in a way the most controversial, the most difficult, and that's talking about repair. How do you get back, I almost said get back to normal. There is no getting back to normal. I think that is something that all three museums and almost all atrocity museums that I've encountered agree upon. Normal from before is not the normal of the future. Things have changed too much. But they all try to draw lessons from the past, and often framed in this some version of the idea of never again. Never again. What is sometimes left unspecified? Is it only the target group that matters? Is it only the perpetrator that matters? Is it all people all the time? But we draw lessons from the past based on that. We try to assess the present. What do we know about how things are at the present, about the level of the standing of the community that had been in peril, about the institutions that do and don't protect those groups, and then how do you reinvent the future? As I said, I think this is really the most challenging part, but it's something that museums, and it's not, as I'll come back to towards the end, the sole responsibility of a museum or a memorial site to reinvent the future or to describe the terms of the future, but often it is, it's the historians, maybe the sociologists, maybe the political scientists who work at museums, who curate museums, that have the opportunity to frame questions about group relations or about individual rights within a pluralistic framework, or about the bounds of identity, how people can think about themselves, and how these concepts can collectively serve the interests of peace, whether that's standing up against hate or promoting tolerance, two sides perhaps of the same coin, but two sides that might actually involve very different sets of policies. Briefly here towards the contradictions. These, as I've suggested, and I think as you've all recognized, these are difficult tasks. Every step of the way, retelling, remembering, and focusing on repair are all difficult. But they're made especially difficult in these contexts because I would argue that, again, a little bit of political science being infused here, that history is really a matter of narratives in competition with one another. And I don't want to be so Foucauldian that I'm suggesting that there is no truth. There is a truth. Things happened. We can't and should not deny that those things. We should establish monuments to prevent the denial that those things happen. But all these questions of why and who and even where or when, there's always a debate about what is the, when a museum looks at such and such an event from when to when, well, the when A and when B require some justification and explanation and often some controversy. But history, history as narratives means that, sometimes narratives have less room for nuance, less room for understanding of questions of maybe compromised participation, compromised victimhood. And can we even talk about compromised participation? That is, committing an atrocity with a gun pointed at you, for example, is what I mean by that. Or compromised victimhood, being a surviving by and being a victim of, for example, sort of a sexual slavery, and then surviving, but also being providing information to your persecutors, your rapists, even these sorts of things are very difficult, obviously, to talk about. I'm stammering and stumbling as I bring them up here, but they end up being not a common theme, I think an unspoken theme in many survivor communities. There's a level of suspicion towards those who survive sometimes, because of the knowledge of the choices that people might have had to make to survive. Beyond that, there's a fear of guilt. That if we think about Turkey and Armenia and the Republic of Turkey's 110-year effort to deny or to prevent, I won't even say deny, I just want to say prevent the recognition of what they have done as an atrocity. I guess I can't say 110 years because the word genocide only came about in the 1940s, but we can call it a 70-year effort to prevent the word genocide from being applied to late Ottoman, early Turkish atrocities against Armenian people. And that's motivated not by a fear of guilt like, oh, it'll keep me up at night, maybe it is, but certainly a fear of guilt like, well, do we owe them something? Do we have to give them back land? Do we owe reparations? My country, the United States, reparations for slavery is an issue that comes up quite, I wouldn't say often, it comes and goes to some extent. I think some people, many people say, well, why should I feel guilty? I wasn't alive then. I think it's not really about guilt. But even then, if you say that, yes, the response becomes yes, but it is about paying reparations. It is about redistributing resources. And again, my group in my time wasn't responsible, so why should my group in my time be part of that redistribution of resources? Yeah, these are kind of legitimate concerns. They're not to be brushed away, and they make the process of forming the future, setting a chart for the future, all the more difficult, because I think a lot of those times these questions of not guilt, but responsibility do matter and do have to be addressed. And in fact, from victim groups, survivor groups, it's very important that responsibility be acknowledged, even by people who are not directly responsible. That perhaps acknowledging responsibility doesn't mean owning responsibility, it simply means not denying that responsibility. And when that doesn't happen, there's a silence. And that silence over certain events bears, I think, a tremendous social cost. So finally, let me get to those museums, USHMM, Srebrenica, and KGM in Rwanda, and just say a word or two about how I think each one of these manages and maybe some of the contextual issues that hinder. For USHMM, I think of it, maybe it's because of maybe the first genocide museum, atrocity museum that I really got to know well or thought about in academic terms. For me, they've established the paradigm of all of these things. Everything that I mentioned, I think, comes from my exposure, at least, to USHMM, and including their emphasis on lessons, on looking forward, and their education projects. And also, I think one thing that's really worth pointing out is that they allow space for talking about rescue. And actually, it's Yad Vashem, which is in many ways in Israel, in many ways a more narrow, deeper and narrower view of the events. Yad Vashem also was as an organization established the Righteous Among Nations principle, which is for an official recognition of acts of rescue, selfless acts of rescue during the Holocaust. And I think that's one of these things that can really play into repair. But USHMM and other Holocaust museums certainly face challenges, one of which I think is, and even just to say this will sound more controversial than I mean it. I don't mean to invoke controversy, but it will come off that way. It's giving ideological primacy to Zionism. And I say that not as an opponent of Zionism, not as not as an opponent or proponent. Just to, I think empirically, these museums see Israel as the state of Israel as a necessary project, as part of the repair and security guarantee for former victims of the Holocaust. I think that is, as an empirical statement, that's an understandable view. But as opposition to acts undertaken by the state of Israel grows globally. Again, I'm not asking anybody here to take one side or the other, just to recognize that there is opposition out there. It challenges these museums' close connection to the idea of Zionism. And this is an area that I think that these museums are going to be struggling with, battling with in years, months, years, and even decades to come. The USHMM, Trump, one of his many acts of reorganizing institutions was to fire the entire board of USHMM. I think in part because he was worried, or people supporting him told him that the museum was sort of insufficiently pro-Israel, and he wanted a strong pro-Israel, maybe less intellectual, less academic board in charge. But that's an example of how that gets in the way. Okay, let me turn to Srebrenica again. The Srebrenica Museum, I have another chance to go there in a couple weeks. It's really well done. It really tells the story of the murder of 8,000 Bosnian, mostly men, in Srebrenica over the course of less than a week's time in July 1995. But what's interesting to me about Srebrenica is that it's in the context, it's located in the town of Srebrenica, which is located within the entity called the Republika Srpska, which is a Serb-dominated entity within the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina that came about from the Dayton settlement that 30 years ago ended the Bosnian War and gave sort of sovereignty within a state to this area called Srpska, dominated by Serbs, and therefore becomes a very unfriendly place or a difficult place for many Bosnians to live. And the challenge, I think, for the Srebrenica Memorial is to make the case, to educate, but also make the case that there is space and there's space for Bosnians, the people who, the survivors, to come back and live. The terms of that Dayton Accord that I mentioned say that Bosnians should come back and live, that they have a right to come back and live. And what I would love for the museum to try to do, and I think it does this, but it's just extraordinarily difficult, is to promote the cause of return and promote the ways in which both Serb populations and Bosnian populations that can come about. Finally, moving on to KGM, Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda. They, again, same basic model. I think they're following the paradigm of USHMM. Very well designed, very moving experience. As I mentioned in reading their mission statement, they're as much geared towards an international audience as they are to a local one. And they draw connections with other cases as well, including the Holocaust, Namibia, Armenia, Bosnia. They also do this within a context that's almost the polar opposite of Srebrenica in terms of post-atrocity belonging. Whereas in Srebrenica, there is, by institutional design, by institutional design, a very difficult context for rebelonging, as I called it earlier on. In Rwanda, you have something like rebelonging by decree. The state has said that Tutsis and Hutus will live together again as Rwandans. In fact, they won't even call themselves Hutus and Tutsis, they'll call themselves Rwandan. And it's very powerful. I think it's very, in many ways, very effective. But it also papers over, sometimes bulldozes over many of those nuances that I talked about before. And many people are in different places in terms of thinking about the past. Finally, museums of displacement, I think, because we're in one now, they tell the story of uprooting, and the challenge is to talk about return in a way. What is the community that people have returned to? Is there a story of rebelonging? What are the dimensions of rebelonging? I think, although I've invented these words, that there are elements of that in the exhibition here that I find quite encouraging, and that can stand as a model for other museums that confront similar stories. Let me conclude with just a couple, maybe points of modesty here. One, maybe not so much a point of modesty, but an awareness of politics. I talked about Trump and the USHMM. There is a political element to the KGM experience as well, in that many museums, there's not a lot of freedom from the state to operate as, to explore nuances. There's a narrative and there's a reason to follow a certain narrative. That can be good, but it can also ignore challenges. It can create its own truth in a way that that stifles debate, particularly if the organization in charge of setting that course has a particular objective other than creating a peaceful, integrated community in the future. It's not clear, though, if removing from state control, how one creates independence for museums, if it involves total removal from state control, because sometimes private museums, private organizations can be even more biased, if you will, or even more targeted towards a specific outcome that may have exclusionary elements. And finally, just in terms of the humility, though, I think that the people, this is an extraordinarily difficult job, creating museums that have a prospect of rebuilding communities. Every context is different, in the context, as I think I've tried to illustrate, certainly matters. There are other players in the peace building theater, games is the wrong word to use, but theater or realm that have more ability in most cases to shape what rebuilding looks like. And so what museums do contributes, maybe even sets the tone, but it doesn't always, it doesn't hold all the cards, if you will. The timing matters when things happen, as does the sort of variegation across the broad scope of programming, the balance between education, between commemoration, and between intellectual exchange. All of these things contribute to this broader project. All of these things can and must be pursued, and all of these things must be done so in full knowledge that they are only part of the story. So on that very humble note, I will conclude. Hopefully I've left a little bit time for questions. I realize now I've talked far longer than I had promised I would. It's a academic's disease. And I thank you for your attention and for those online as well.
you, Professor, for your speech. It was very interesting, and especially it was the subject very difficult. So we know in our museum that this is not the simple subject, and we try to work every day. So now this is the time for your questions. I think the 2-3 questions before the break.
I actually have one remark and one question. I'll start with the question, and it's kind of a contemporary one. You mentioned this case study of Holocaust Museum, Holocaust Memorial Museum in the US, and my question is, after this outbreak of new atrocities in Israel towards Palestinians, is the museum team working on that, and is there any scientific approach in your research or of your colleagues' research covering the topic that actually this might be a kind of a revenge towards some people, or maybe other concept is supporting these actions? I don't want to be a proponent or opponent of this as well, but my question is if anything is done to work with this new topic, because you mentioned during your presentation, and I find it really inspiring, that things should be named. It should be voiced, and then we can follow with supporting it, not supporting it, but we first start to voicing it, okay? So my question is, if it's voiced.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's a great question in that it really matters, the answer really matters, but also that we don't really know yet. I think you've pinpointed, I share that sense of it's an area where the museum has some responsibility to act, but I can tell you what the two things that have happened at the museum. One is a statement, and I think it was in 2024 at some point, a statement issued saying, without using any specifics, and I know it's very controversial within the museum, a statement that said, people should not use the word genocide lightly. People should not misuse the word genocide. Didn't give any specifics, but it was very clear that this was a statement of opposition to the war against Palestinians in Gaza being termed a genocide. That I think set in motion some of the battles within the board and on the staff that culminated in the removal of the board and the replacement of the board with people who would have issued a stronger statement in that respect, saying Gaza is not a genocide. Because what we saw was a compromise, and people who could read between the lines saw that it was essentially saying Gaza is not a genocide, but you didn't use those words. And there were, I think, a lot of staffers and maybe some board members who did want to call it a genocide. So the first change was this contested statement that ended up in a compromise that left no one happy. And the second action was the changeover in the board, designed to show that one side of that compromise had just prevailed over the other. Is there space to talk about genocide, in a Holocaust museum, to talk about genocide? Well, genocide in Gaza, or the possibility of genocide in Gaza. I think there absolutely is, because these museums have committed to talking about genocide in a comparative context. I think the best way to do it would be by looking at the case at the ICJ, because it's about interpretation of genocide. And if they really wanted to pursue that education mandate, that education part of their mission, what they would be saying is, well, here is a case where genocide is being put to test. Here is why it comes to the ICJ. Here are the issues that they're looking at. Maybe even here's the underlying politics of who agrees that the ICJ is a valid forum or not. But here are the questions that at least that court will be looking at. And here are the consequences of that decision, which may be nothing. It may be that the ICJ is something that everyone ignores. But that whole range of discussion, at least as a genocide studies scholar, is really important. And that a museum sort of ducks it, I think is problematic.
Thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask a more personal question.
Sure.
You have been researching genocide, and is anything like a research puzzle that has not yet been addressed and still excites you?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, it's actually a good question. I mean, again, political scientist, not historian, so many of the research puzzles are history projects that involve looking at archives and understanding, for example, why were, I'm trying to think of an example that matters. Why did the mechanics of a certain genocide? Why did the Rwandan the Rwandan government army, why did it choose to allocate military resources towards exterminating the Tutsi population rather than fighting the Tutsi-led army that was trying to overthrow it? It's a very detailed question, and it's one that I haven't seen a satisfactory answer for. In part, I think, because it's very difficult to study in Rwanda. The government would like sort of foreknowledge that you are going to agree with their position before you start studying, and that can be problematic. As a political scientist, again, I've gravitated towards post-atrocity questions, and for me, this question of as I call it, rebelonging, is very open ground. We don't know how to rebuild societies. Most states that have and communities that have undergone atrocity, in my view, fail to rebuild afterwards and are prone to more atrocities later. To talk about Rwanda again, I think the Rwandan government has done some really groundbreaking innovations towards rebuilding societies that are underappreciated by the rest of the world, including a community labor project called Umuganda, where everybody, Hutu, Tutsi, unemployed vagrant, and banker, goes out on the streets once a month and cleans up. And that creates a sense of community, a sense of belonging within the nation. Everyone probably grumbles about it. I'm sure people typically aren't happy to do it. They probably have better things to do on their first Saturday afternoon. But it's the type of thing that builds community and builds nation. And I'm really curious as to, I'm sure that community trash pickup is not the only way to go about it. And maybe there's a way to generate community outside of such programs. But that's the type of questions that I think are very much open at this moment.
I actually also had a remark I mentioned, and
Yes.
you got to this with your answer. So,
Oh, good.
Talking about this rebelonging, I have an interesting remark on the situation of Poles after the evacuation from the Soviet Union, because many of them never came back to Poland.
Right.
They settled all over the world, as our exhibition tells the story of that. And many of these groups made their own kind of identity, and they did not come back home, but somehow they managed to keep an image of Poland as a homeland in their hearts and create some interesting solutions how to maintain that. And on one hand, there are very, very specified communities like that in New Zealand,
Right.
in the US, in the UK, in Argentina as well. And on the other hand, there are many people who somehow decided that's not my case. I want to keep aside.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there are actually two major ways you can go.
Yeah.
You can follow this
Right.
location, and you can just start your own life from scratch.
And I'll just add to that. It's an interesting observation that I think has certain consequences that go with it. One of which is that sometimes exile communities have an idea of the homeland that is frozen in time, and the homeland develops in a very different way that the exile community remembers. And if they do come back into contact, there can be some form of conflict. Typically, there's this recognition of we're all Poles. Or the example I have in my mind is the East Timorese, where there is an elite in 1975 that was expelled or exiled themselves, largely expelled by when Indonesia took over, and a lot of them went to Portugal. Meanwhile, within East Timor, there was a less well-educated resistance that battled against Indonesian rule. And when Indonesia gained independence, these Portuguese-based exiles came back and said, all right, we're ready to lead. And the local Timorese said, no, you've been gone for 25 years. You don't know this country. We're here. And it's a little bit less about that idea of nation, but it is this kind of conflict of exiles versus those who remained. That's part of the story. It needs to be told. And you know, if a museum might be funded by an exile community, I'm not saying that about this one or about anything in East Timor, but hypothetically, you know, when a museum is funded by exiles, you know, which often may have more wherewithal to do so, you might end up with a different version, one that kind of deviates from some of the realities or necessities in country on the ground.
Some more questions?
Hello, I'd like to ask you about psychology, because we know that there is a psychology research about genocide. Is it somehow taken into consideration in those museums that you've mentioned, maybe others? Because, well, we know it's a huge topic, and for historians, we speak about what happened maybe from other perspective.
Yeah, very good question. And yeah, I'll have to wear that political science hat once again, where at least the discipline is practiced these days is very skeptical of psychological explanations. But when I come to genocide studies, they're inevitable. I think of Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, as one of the best it's not really a examine of psychology on openly. Browning, I guess, is a historian. But, you know, what he does, he looks at who belonged to one police battalion, Germans who belonged to a police battalion that I think was part of the Einsatzgruppen that committed genocidal atrocities in Poland, I think, is where they were active. And he's asking the question, why did these guys do it? And although there's a part an economic reason, it really comes down to the psychology of they did it because everyone else was. They did it for camaraderie camaraderie is a little bit too light a version of it, but they did it because it's what they felt they were supposed to be doing. And that's fundamentally a psychological sense, the psychology of how does kind of the momentum of what's around you and what others are doing, how does that mesh with the moral compass that we all assume everybody has in the first place? The Rwandan version of Christopher Browning, or the version of Christopher Browning with respect to Rwanda, one of many, Jean Hatzfeld has written now, I guess, 6 books, most famous of which is called Machete Season. It's based on interviews with Rwandan perpetrators. And a lot of it's very matter of fact, but you can't help but read it for a sense of psychology. That said, I'm not sure that it's easy to generalize across different circumstances and cases and histories. But fundamentally, the psychology of the perpetrator and the psychology of the rescuer and the psychology of the bystander, they are all, I think, very worthy subjects of future investigation as well. So thanks for the question.